Hi, welcome back. I've been away for a week or so. I've actually been building a new PC so I can get these videos edited for you a little bit better. And I'm going to do another video in the security series. Consistently, that series is the one that people ask me for. They all want more security stories. Some of them are kind of difficult to talk about for various different reasons. This fell into that category. I had actually done a video about this before and taken it down. So it is concerning Albanians in the security industry. It touches on the whole immigration issue. That was a huge kind of blacklisted topic only a few months ago, that anyone discussing even that subject on YouTube probably was going to get some problems with the channel and might even get a visit from the police at their door, because we had the whole riots going on and there was a big crackdown on that. Since then, the government have taken a huge U-turn, probably because they were getting absolutely shafted in the local polls, and they've now decided that yes, immigration is in fact an issue and it can be discussed. So I'm going to discuss some of that now and what I saw in the security industry. So this really dates back, going back probably about 15 years, and that was when I first started to see issues occurring. Now, bear in mind, in the security industry, there's always been some kind of unpleasant characters around it. There's often been criminal gangs that have tried to take over security operations in order to ply drugs trade, all that kind of stuff. Let's put it this way, they were kind of doing their thing and not causing too many problems in terms of like outright violence, because they just wanted to get on with their business and not cause too much trouble. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that was how it was at the time. It was quite a settled industry. You either had people doing legitimate security, or you had these kind of enshrined dodgy firms that were playing their trade but weren't really bothering people to a large extent. And then we had a situation, so I was working down on the south coast at the time in Brighton, and we had a situation where we started seeing a huge influx of immigrant workers coming over, mostly unskilled, that were looking to get into the security industry. This coincided with a time when the government was trying to make its unemployment figures look better as well. Obviously, they were trying to boost the kind of employment figures for immigration to make it look like it was a very productive thing, that, you know, we were allowing people to come over to do these amazing jobs. And they therefore started handing out SIA licenses like candy, and the courses became like 100% pass. You know, I even saw people that hardly could speak English get through these SIA courses with some help from the instructors and filling out the paperwork, etc. They started to go to the job centres and actually offer like incentives for people to come off of long-term sick and start going into the security industry. So we had not only an influx of immigrants, but we also had quite an influx of just people that weren't really suited to the job anyway, that were doing it because they had been made to pretty much by the government. But what we did see was specifically Albanians coming over into the security industry, and it wasn't all bad. So let's start with this, and this kind of lays the foundation to some of what I'm going to talk about. I worked with a couple of really great Albanian guys, so I'll get that out of the way first. They were decent guys. They weren't heavily involved in any of the, you know, dodgy stuff that was going on that I'll talk about a bit later. But they told me a lot about it. So they actually came over here and they wanted nothing to do with any of the other Albanian guys. They just wanted to get on with their work. They were happy to be out of Albania, and they simply wanted to work in the security industry, and they were decent guys. So those were the kind of immigrants that we appreciated, right? You know, they come over here, they want to embed themselves into our culture. They were really interested to learn the language. They were very, very good guys. They were reliable. They were trustworthy. But they admitted to me that a large quantity of the guys that they knew had come over here didn't have such great intentions, and their intentions were more from a criminal perspective. Unbelievably, at the time, we actually had criminals coming over from Albania, and they were passing the basic DBS checks, like the criminal records checks, because the DBS checks, and I don't know if this has changed since, but in the security industry at the time, all they did was check your UK criminal record. If you didn't have a UK criminal record, you were good to go. So you might have just stabbed some people in Albania, jumped on a train or whatever it was, a ferry, come over here, and then got some work and been passed completely fine to do security. That put a lot of people's noses out of joint, because about that same time a lot of the English guys through the SIA system were getting cut out of being able to do security because they had fairly minor assault charges on their names and stuff that had happened to them when they were younger, and that had precluded them from actually getting any work. So they were aware that criminals were coming from another country getting work that they would previously have done, and they were banned from doing it themselves. So these guys told me a lot about Albania, you know, their upbringing and why there were criminal elements over there that were coming over to this country in order to work here. So we get a bit into the kind of history and politics of the country, that at one point Albania was almost completely sealed off from the rest of the world. It was not unlike North Korea, probably not in the same style and political persuasion, but certainly it was very much sealed off. You couldn't just come and go as you pleased. You weren't allowed to just randomly go on holiday there. The Albanians themselves weren't allowed to leave without special permits from the government. And in fact, at the time, it was one of the only regions that didn't suffer from the HIV/AIDS epidemic because of this lack of travel through the borders. So whilst that epidemic spread around the rest of Europe, Albania was pretty much free from it because they literally weren't coming in and out of the country. So good from that perspective, you know, stopping viral spread, but pretty sad from the perspective of the people that lived there, because they were living in a fairly unpleasant regime. They didn't have a nice standard of living. You know, the government kind of forced them to have to buy the products that the government wanted them to buy. They didn't have like a free market. So the people were really, really upset about that. Gradually it got to a situation where they revolted, and they basically overthrew the system. They overthrew the government. And he described, you know, one of the guys I worked with described actually kind of being involved in that situation, where he talked about things like the police casting off their uniforms because the police began to realise that these angry rioting mobs would not be able to be controlled. And at that point the police thought, well, we can either stay in our police costumes and kind of fight these mobs and probably get killed, or we can just cast our uniforms off and kind of join the mobs ourselves. And bear in mind as well that the police at the time in that country were poorly paid. They weren't particularly well treated either. You had this situation where none of the governmental workers that would normally be able to control these people were particularly interested in doing what the government said, because they were also being mistreated. So then you had complete anarchy. Now this went on for several years in that country. So at first you had just this kind of anarchic situation where people were running about. The government was basically torn apart. There was no military control. There was no police control. People were just doing whatever they wanted. After that settled down, it became like a feudal situation. So you basically had people forming up into rival groups and gangs unofficially, and they were just fighting for survival in a country that now had no official like logistics chains or anything like that. So they were just fighting over the scraps, and that was described to me in ways that, you know, would make your skin crawl if you really went into it. You can Google all this, you can have a look on Wikipedia or whatever, but it won't probably go into the really graphic details. But we're talking about people that were literally cannibalizing one another for food, that if you didn't join one of the gangs that were kind of running territories, that you were basically, you know, free meat, and you had to join these gangs, and then by joining them you would be made to do all kinds of horrific stuff in order to forward the survival of the gang and its members. And this was like a standard practice for anyone living in that region. That's what they were having to do. So it was a horrific, frightening time. Obviously there was all kinds of horrific crimes being conducted, because funnily enough, when you leave people alone and you don't have supervision over them, they don't, as the left always suggest, kind of default to skipping around and hugging each other. What they actually default to is some pretty unpleasant behaviours. And you can imagine, I won't kind of demonetize the video and get a strike on the channel by discussing all those behaviours, but if you can imagine the worst things that people would do to each other, you're pretty much there. So that sets the scene for the way that some of these people had been brought up. Even though things had changed and they now had a government and the country was being run in a proper fashion, let's say, although probably still slightly corrupt and not as proper as many other countries, things were a lot better, a lot safer. But you had these criminal groups that had formed up, and they continue to operate because they're not just going to relinquish all power and all control because now a government's there, right? These are criminal groups that have gone through absolute savagery. They're going to retain as much criminal control as they possibly can over things like the black market, which they did. Now, because of the ruthlessness of these gangs and how they would operate and how quick they were to jump into extremely violent confrontations with one another to end what would be, in other terms, petty squabbles, you know, their petty squabbles would end up with people getting their heads chopped off, that people that had upset those gangs would naturally want to get as far away as possible from them. So a lot of the people that moved to the UK from Albania at that time were people that had upset the gangs, that didn't want to be part of that lifestyle, and they were, you know, in fear for their lives, but maybe they had also been part and parcel of that problem as well, that they may have been working with those gangs, they may have been committing some of those acts themselves. So it was kind of a grey area. It's an area that I completely understand why people became immersed in that. I'm not making a moral judgment on them. I'm just telling it as it was told to me from people that actually went through it. That sets a little bit of background to having an understanding of why the Albanians were so keen to come to places like the UK, and maybe some of the culture and values behind some of those people, you know, what they had experienced and how they had become desensitized, and then suddenly when they come to the UK, they're not just going to change as human beings, you know, they're still the same person. So that was a concern. The first time I became aware in the security world of this being a serious problem was I went for a job. I got invited to go for a job at a strip club, and I've actually made videos about the strip club before. I made one about the girls there and stuff. That was quite popular, so have a look on this playlist. You can go back and look at that video. But when I got there, you know, I said to them, why do you need a new head doorman? And they said, well, unfortunately, you know, we didn't really want to mention this, but the last one isn't with us anymore. And I said, oh, did he, you know, leave under a black cloud? You know, was there some problem? And they said, no, I mean, not with us anymore, like he isn't alive. And I said, oh, well, you know, did he have an accident? What happened? And they said, no, he was actually killed by some gang members. And that concerned me, obviously, because they want me to become the head doorman of a venue where the previous head doorman has been killed by gang members. So then I said, well, look, I'm interested in the job, but you're going to have to give me some details on that, because that's going to affect my maybe how much I ask for, or maybe even if I want the job or not. And it turned out he was an Albanian guy. He was deeply immersed in some unpleasantness, some illegal activities. He had upset some rival Albanian guys, so very much like the situation I've just described back in the country, that they didn't like what he had done. So they then proceeded to stab him on his way home from work multiple times, like it was a ridiculous amount of times he got stabbed. Then they ran him over several times as well, just to not teach him a lesson, because he would have probably been dead by then, but to make a point to anyone else that was thinking about crossing them. That gives you some sort of idea on their ideas about justice. So I ended up taking that job, and I didn't have any Albanians working for me at that place because I was aware historically there was obviously some issues. I just had a couple of English guys come and work for me. That was no problem at all. And I didn't see any more issues there. After that, I moved over to the beachfront where we had several big nightclubs. At the time, they were pretty big nightclubs, even on the UK scene. You know, people would come from all over the UK to come to them. You had like the Honey Club, the Zap, the Funky Buddha, all those places down on the front. And like I say, people would come from all around the country to go to those. So they could get very busy, and they would also get pretty violent because they attracted gang members from various different places. We used to get a lot of people come down from London. That was only an hour's drive. So they would come down from the different postcodes in London and all be kind of pretty annoyed with each other. So it was a rough load of venues to work. And we slowly started to see the Albanian guys taking over those venues. Then as we were running some of those venues, the door teams that we had, we started getting some problems with the Albanian guys. So they would basically say to us, what do you think you're doing here? You know, this is like our territory. And they would start sending some Albanian guys in to kick off, cause problems. And the main trick there in the security world is that if you want someone else's door, if you want to take it, you would send in some guys, like undercover guys, let's say. They would just come in and they would start kicking off, cause trouble, beat up all the doormen, make a mess of the club. And then the owners of the club would think, well, this door team isn't up to the job of protecting us. It's not earning its, you know, we're paying them, they're not earning their money, they're not doing what we want them to do, and they're causing more problems than they're worth. So then the Albanian company would come in, make them an offer and say, hey, you know, we heard your door team had a bit of a problem, maybe you could go with our door team, we can guarantee you won't have a problem. So it's like a money with menaces scam. And funny enough, a lot of clubs would fall for that, you know, because all the club owners wanted was a quiet life. They didn't want fights in the clubs, they didn't want the police aggro, they didn't want customers getting frightened off. So whatever they could do to make the quietest night possible, that's what they were going to do. So it was quite an effective strategy. We didn't put up with that. We were very good at spotting, you know, if you had a couple of massive bruising great guys in the queue that didn't really fit in clubland, they looked like doormen themselves, then I'm not going to let them in, frankly, because either they know me or they know some of my team or they're not from round here. And if they look really out of place, I'm just going to play it on the safe side and say, sorry guys, not tonight. Sometimes you would get those guys try and start a fight outside or fight outside. But what happened outside wasn't really an issue for inside the club. You know, what the managers didn't see, they didn't care about. And generally we were able to move those guys off and kind of deal with them a little bit further away, which was standard practice. But it got to the point where we were actually being approached by Albanian criminal groups that were basically making threats to us and saying, look, you guys are encroaching on our industry. And we were saying, well, what do you mean, you know? And they would say, you're in that club, running that club, we need to be running that club. And I would say, well, what do you mean? You know, like it's a free market, we've got the club, we're doing a good job, I don't see the problem. And they said, no, you don't understand. We need to control that club because we're going to sell our drugs there and you're on our territory, basically. And my attitude towards that was, I don't care about your territory, I don't care about your drugs, I'm not interested in any of that, I'm just interested in doing my business, and you kind of mind your business and we'll both get on our own ways. But they didn't see it that way. You know, they saw us as a fly in the ointment. And I was actually pretty offended that someone had come from another country and was telling me that I didn't belong in a job in my own country, and that I should get out to kind of pave the way for them. And so threats were made. You know, we had various different threats, and they said, you know, you better think about this because your life's in danger. And we took that pretty seriously because that's not a good thing, considering some of the levels of violence that these gangs had used in the past. And like I described, some guy was killed in a pretty horrific manner, and that wasn't the only one. There was multiple guys killed in those sort of situations. That was just the one that I specifically knew about because of my job. And it came to a head in the end. We kind of put a team of guys together. We found out that the boss of this large gang or group or whatever you want to call it would often be sat in one of the clubs on a Friday and Saturday night, and he was kind of the guy to go and speak to. So we put a little team of guys together that were all very capable of looking after themselves, made up of basically people that were like from the MMA gym, people like from powerlifting backgrounds, just a lot of big, brutal, strong guys, and also guys that had A lot of them had military backgrounds and were not guys that would be easily intimidated. Most of those guys weren't particularly frightened of being hurt and even weren't particularly frightened of dying. Some of them had very little to lose. So those are kind of the guys you need on your team when you're going to do some talking in that sort of situation, that you cannot have guys that are like absolutely shitting themselves, because it will be blatantly obvious and you will get walked all over. So we went in there. We were let into the club, but we were clearly being watched by the whole door team, because they knew exactly why we'd gone in there, you know, and we'd gone to speak to this guy, and we had a sit down with him, and it reminded me a little bit of a gangster movie, you know, where you see these things happen where like you have to sit with a big boss and he kind of hears you out. And I was partially expecting it not to go well, like in the movies. But we had a sit down, we had a discussion and said, look, we're not going anywhere. This is where we're going to stay. And you guys can kind of butt up against us, but you're literally going to have to kill the whole door team. I even said to him, you know, I don't disbelieve that you might be able to do that. I'm sure that you could kill us all, but that's going to bring a lot of heat on you, because I've got like 15 guys and none of them are going to be very happy about that. They're not going to sit back and let you. And do you really want that amount of heat? I didn't feel that they would actually be able to carry that off and go through that amount of guys, and it would be in the papers, the police would have to be involved, the National Crime Squad would get involved, and it would put massive pressure on the rest of their criminal operation. So I didn't think that they were going to risk that just to take like 1 or 2 clubs off us. So I basically played that card with them and said, you know, that's how I see things. I'm not having a pissing contest with them, because I know at the end of the day they're going to be way more violent than I would be prepared to be. You know, even the guys I had, we weren't the kind of guys that are going to go around someone's house at night and chop their head off or burn their house down. We were just the kind of guys that were prepared to have a straightener, or if someone attacked us, we were prepared to deal with that, but we weren't like a criminal gang. So they definitely had the upper hand there. You've always got to consider that if you're dealing with even one person or a group of people, how far are each of you prepared to take it? It's not particularly at that point about physical strength, it's about how far people are prepared to push. And if you're against someone who's prepared to come around your house in the middle of the night and set it on fire, and you're not prepared to enter into those sort of behaviours, which most of us are not, thank God, then you're going to lose, right? You're going to lose that situation. And people go, oh, well, you can call the police. Yeah, but the police isn't much good if your house has already been burnt down and, you know, your wife was in it or whatever. So you have to consider how far those people are prepared to go, and think of these things strategically, in that even though you know that the combatant that you're dealing with might be prepared to go that far, is that the best strategy for him, given that he has this other business going on and he doesn't want to bring too much heat to it? So in those terms, they kind of backed down. We ended up in an impasse, let's say, that they weren't particularly happy about it, and they were never going to be our best mates, but at the same time, they let us run our clubs in a legitimate, normal manner. They ran their clubs in a completely illegitimate manner, and that's how it ran for quite a while. I actually ended up leaving those clubs and moved on somewhere else. I went and got a different job, so it didn't really affect me after that. But from what I heard from the guys, eventually they did get their way. You know, that eventually, because the door teams bled out a lot of the guys like myself and some of the other like stand-up guys, I would call them, guys that were prepared to kind of go the extra mile and really stand up for themselves. They ended up with cheap security that was basically made of what I would call jacket fillers, so guys that really weren't physically capable. They didn't have the greatest amount of aura about them, you know, they didn't have like a personality, a strong personality. And a lot of these were, as I described, people that have been like scraped off of the dole queue, handed an SIA badge, and then just pushed into these jobs. And the club owners just wanted like the cheapest guys that would fulfill a tick on a box. You know, have I got someone standing at the door? Yes, tick, he's there, he's got a badge, everything's cool. But of course, when those guys got approached by the Albanians and said, you know, we're going to come and take this door, they're not going to argue. because they physically can't. They're not able to put up a fight. They don't look intimidating. They didn't have enough intelligence about them or enough like courage about them to stand up to these guys or reason with them or anything like that. So gradually those doors were taken away, and the Albanians did get their way and start moving throughout the system. When I speak to security guys these days, anyone on the club scene will know that Albanian security are quite a large presence in places where the sale of drugs, the trading of girls can be a commodity. They're a lot more involved in things like human trafficking now, for example. Clubs, although you might not associate clubs with that, they're actually an excellent place for these guys to find possible victims of that, girls that are in a vulnerable situation, that need to earn a bit of extra money. They might befriend these guys, become their boyfriend, let's say, not unlike the grooming scandal that's been going on. Generally, these girls would be older, of the sort of age you would find in a nightclub, and they would become reliant on these guys, and then eventually they would get pimped out and used and put on drugs and whatever and become like the property of these gangs. So there's a lot of that goes on. There's a lot of the drug trade that goes on within the clubs, and a lot of that is because that's the environment that these guys have grown up in. That's the environment they know, and they've come over here because they describe it as a soft touch. When I spoke to a lot of those rival guys, and said, why did you guys even come over here in the first place? They told me it was because we had such a soft system. They described, if we got caught doing what we're doing now in Albania, the prison system over there, you would be lucky to get out alive. If you did a couple of years over there, you'd be lucky if you lived. The food was like rancid. You hardly got any. You might even starve to death. You would be lucky if the officers didn't beat you to death or punish you so badly that you were crippled. And the prisons themselves were absolutely horrific. You were sleeping on bits of concrete and stuff. There was no warmth. It was just a horrible place. And then they come over here, and basically they describe the prisons over here as being the equivalent to what they would call would be quite a nice apartment over there for them to hire out. So there was no consequence for them, that if they got caught, they would basically go to a cushy place where they had Sky TV, a chance to play pool, go to the gym, hang out, warm showers, nice beds, all that kind of stuff. And if they didn't get caught, well, who cared? Because the criminals over here weren't going to the lengths in terms of fighting for territory that they were in Albania. They weren't suddenly just turning up and hacking everyone's heads off. So it was just better all round for those guys. Now, this might have been a controversial subject to discuss if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of this information has been FOI'd, and when we look at the per capita crime rates in this country, the Albanians seem to top that in terms of violent crime, that kind of thing. And the government were not keen on releasing any of this information. Some of it was FOI'd recently from the Office of National Statistics, and that was published in a few of the right-wing newspapers, like the Telegraph, I think, published it. That information did not go along with the governmental narrative that, hey, there's no difference. Whenever the left or the government talk about immigration and crime, they never want to talk about per capita statistics because it doesn't back up their narrative. So that's statistics on how much more likely someone of a certain nationality is to commit a certain crime. Instead, they focus on just overall statistics and say, hey, well, lots of white English people commit those crimes as well, so they're only a small percentage in comparison. But if you look at it in terms of, yeah, but they only make up 0.5% of the population, so of course there would be more white English people committing that kind of crime because there's 99% more of those people around. You have to look at it per capita, then it starts to make sense. That information is now going to be collected and published by the government, so they say, because they've also been looking at European countries that have done this, and they're seeing the same kind of evidence from those statistics. I think Denmark, Sweden have both done the same thing, and it hasn't borne out too well for some of the immigrant populations there. The The other interesting part is it also shows us immigrant communities that are not in those statistics at all. So, I mean, if you look at the Sikh immigrants in this country, you know, they're not going around committing pretty much any crime at all. So this isn't like a racist thing of people saying, hey, we don't want any immigration. It's just people looking at the evidence and saying, why do we want to import these people who are committing this amount of crime? Let's import more of these people who are committing none of the crime. You know, surely that makes common sense to most people. I think there are, when you look at these things deep down, you know, you can look into the history and the culture, and you can understand where some of this behaviour comes from, like I've just described with the Albanian situation. And the same if you go to some of the African countries that are topping these statistics in terms of some of this crime. If you look at how they've been brought up in war zones and desensitised to certain acts of violence and certain other despicable acts, if that's a normal thing to you, then it would be crazy to expect those people to just turn up over here and not be carrying on that type of behaviour, because they've done it for so long, it's normalised to them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would be really fascinated to hear what you think about this. I wanted to do this video because it touches a lot on the issues that everyone's discussing at the moment. You know, it's all over the media about the immigration issue. The British public are absolutely sick to death of having it all rammed down their throats. Finally, Keir Starmer turned around, did a complete U-turn and did a kind of Enoch Powell rivers of blood speech. He got lambasted for it, but it was what people wanted to hear, but probably too little too late from Starmer, who had already sealed his own fate by pushing the whole mass immigration issue, or the unchecked, unskilled mass immigration issue. So yeah, let me know what you think. If you've had any similar experiences, I'd be very interested to hear them. As always, keep the comments sensible. I like to discuss these controversial issues, but if people are going to get stupid, make abusive comments, outright racist comments, or just illegal comments, I'm going to delete them for your sake and mine, because I don't want them on the channel. I don't appreciate them myself, but also I'll delete them because it helps you. Because if you've said something illegal and the wrong person sees that, you're going to get a knock at the door, and I don't want people to be arrested for words that they've said. Obviously that seems a little Orwellian to me, but I also understand those are the laws, we have to abide by them. So I'm doing you a favour. Even if you think that I'm censoring you, I'm actually trying to help you out. Thanks a lot for watching. Take care. I'll catch you all next time.